want kicking the things out of orbit.
Oh my gosh!
One
One of the greatest fighters.
John Jones beat every champion pretty much never lived.
If Khabib gets his hands on McGregor, it's going to be that night.
Let's get into it. And welcome to another episode of This Week in MMA. As always, one half of your hosting duo, Craig Allen. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram, and I implore you should, at Craig Allen FNP. With me, as always, Matt Allen on the respective socials. It's pretty easy. It's Matt Allen FNP, and you can find us at Fight Night Picks. Now, Matt, I love doing This Week in MMA. We brought it back. It's been about a month now. And if you're not used to the show, this is totally outside of the bounds of anything else that we do on this channel, because normally it's picks and predictions. We do all the research. We drone on. Then we have our preview show. And then we do a fight companion. And those are cool. But with this show, we really get to kind of go back to our roots and where everything really all started about this time of year 3 years ago. It's kind of crazy to see where Fight Night Picks has gone in this long but also short amount of time. And ultimately, Matt, we have a really big week in MMA.
Oh, we really do, and it felt like last weekend, Ben Askren and Jake Paul kind of overshadowed the UFC. It feels like this weekend, the UFC is the one really overshadowing or really getting all the attention in the combat sports world this weekend. Of course, we have Masvidal Usman too, but we have a lot of other great fights that we could be talking about. There's KSW this weekend. There's a PFL that I'm sure we're going to get to. Just a lot going on in the MMA world outside the UFC.
So much going on, and as you mentioned, I mean, KSW has a really big card coming up this weekend. We'll talk about it, and we'll give you an in-depth bit of analysis and a preview for the main event, the rematch, one of the other big rematches for a title, the heavyweight title. You got Tomasz Narkun moving back up to take on Phil DeFries. And with the PFL, it's the start of the season and ultimately a stock card top to bottom. I'm a little bit surprised with some of the seeding of some of the fights because, I mean, Bubba Jenkins, Lance Palmer, let's face it, probably not the most exciting fight you're ever going to see, but very, very high-level wrestlers, and they're not even up near the top of the main card for that PFL card. So, ultimately, we've got a really big week of MMA ahead, but let's throw it on over to my favorite segment of the show, and you know this one by now. It's called the Twitter Purge.
It's time for the Twitter Purge.
And Matt, when we're flipping it on over to the Twitter Purge, I gotta go right at Beastin 25-8, Corey Anderson. He had such an impressive performance in the co-main event last week of Bellator 257 against the relative unknown and divisional dark horse Dovletshan Yagshimuradov, and ultimately Corey Anderson looked great, and he threw out the tweet, UFC gave me the career, Bellator gave me the life, and it is great to see, regardless of your feelings on the guy who coined the phrase, I don't even know if he's the first guy to do it, but there's levels to this! Levels! Corey Anderson, when he was with the UFC, it's kind of funny because a lot of people figured this is a guy that's either going to knock somebody out, ground and pound them out, or get absolutely obliterated. And Matt, you make the jokes. Well, Jean Vellante finished him, and Shogun beat him, and Jimmy Mano knocked him out, and OSP finished him. But it was that 4-fight run before he lost to leave the UFC that was incredibly impressive. And you look at it, Pat Cummins, Glover Teixeira, Ilir Latifi, Johnny Walker, and the way that he beat guys like Cummins, Latifi, and Teixeira was absolutely amazing. The Walker fight, Walker's a glass cannon if we've ever seen one. That's a great win. But to me, it was more impressive to beat those guys the way that he did. So Anderson loses to Blachowicz, ends up in Bellator, and people probably wrote him off when he left. Like, this is just silly. But listen, ultimately, I'm glad to see the guy cash in. We're definitely pro fighters making money. Oh, yeah. And at 31 years of age, Corey Anderson in Bellator probably still has a pretty good run left in him. And I don't know where you rank him among the light heavyweights in this Grand Prix. But man, he's got a good shot. But good for him to at least be getting paid and really providing here.
So this is the only thing that concerns me. Is Corey Anderson not counting his chickens before they've hatched? Like, he still has quite a bit of his Bellator career to go. He could get starched his next 2 fights, and then he's on Bellator prelims, and then no one's talking about Corey Anderson. Like, I understand, yes, he might be making more money just to show up, and that's a great thing. We're pro that, like you had said. But I'm going to quote Chael Sonnen, where I do feel like this does take place with Corey Anderson. no one ever canceled their Saturday night plans because Corey Anderson's fighting. No one in the history of ever said, hey, no, I can't go do anything. Corey Anderson's fighting on Saturday. I have to be home. He would have been more popular in the UFC if he had just marketed himself that way. There just wasn't a lot of Corey Anderson fans by the time he was on his way out. And a lot of people did know him more for that. There's levels to this and then get knocked out by Jan Blachowicz than they knew him for his great wins. Because I do think the martial artist Corey Anderson is definitely a top 10 light heavyweight in the world. I don't think there'd be much pushback with that. He is very, very well-rounded and has a great skill set. It's just I do feel like he's getting a little bit ahead of himself. He still probably has to fight either Rumble Johnson, Yoel Romero, maybe Vadim Nemkov too, just depending on how far he goes in the tournament. Like, he's getting a little ahead of himself, that's all.
I mean, there are levels to the game, and he does actually have a pretty prominent teammate fighting this weekend over with the UFC, and we've got so many good fights. But Carl Roberson, the guy, you train the hands with Roberson, you train the wrestling with Beastin 25-8, whether they're at Cantone's MMA or at Killa B. But yeah, I mean, Corey Anderson, great to see. The interesting thing, though, and I wanted to add it here, was the fact that Corey Anderson has this to say. And then in the mentions, you have Luis Pena saying, yeah, you know, I took a boxing fight on 12 hours notice, and I made more in a random boxing fight than I did all the way up to fighting into the UFC. And Luis Pena, you know, you look at his fight last weekend. Did he beat Alexander Munoz? This is the opportunity where we can really talk about it. Because for me, I picked Munoz to win going into it. Then I had second thoughts and some reservations. We went to question mark kicks. We both had Pena. But when I watched that fight, Pena won the third round easy. The second round was close. Munoz won the first. I thought Munoz won the second round. But the trouble for me is Luis Pena is one of these guys like, man, I could make money boxing. That's cool. I fight, but I switch a bunch of gyms. It's just, to me, it's a really weird look. It is.
But this is the problem, though. Like, you're putting too much on Luis Pena here. Like, if he could make more money doing other things. Here's the thing. Luke Thomas has tweeted about this. It's with regards to Kamaru Usman saying, after I beat Masvidal, like, there's not that much more left for me to do. It's telling that everyone in MMA wants to get out of MMA. Like, I don't think this is an indictment on Luis Pena and his ability to fight. I think this is more just like, hey, this sport isn't where it really needs to be with paying their athletes and compensating their athletes. Like, you never hear about baseball players who have to take, like, oh yeah, I did a home run derby in my spare time and made more money than I did over All-Star Weekend. Like, these just aren't things that you hear about in other sports. And for Luis Pena, here, I thought he won the fight against Munoz. I did, just ever so slightly. He was just the more active guy on the feet. When Munoz had success, he was landing some shots, but it just never felt like his shots were adding up to the Luis Pena shots. So for me, that fight wasn't a fight where you go like, hey, Pena deserved to win or Munoz deserved to win. Neither guy really did enough to separate themselves, and that's the problem, where you can't get all that outraged about decision, where neither guy really had a good claim to win the fight. And with Pena, it just is unfortunate, because we do see this a lot of the times, and even with Ben Askren taking the fight against Jake Paul, for instance, like, you don't see retired basketball players being like, yeah, I'll play a college guy for some extra money after I retire, just for some more money.
What about the big three?
The big three no one watches, and there's barely any good players in it. It's a bunch of guys who aren't that good in the league who still want to play after they're done. My whole point is that it's a very specific problem to MMA. It's just not a great look for the sport at the end of the day.
So it's one of those ones, and we can continue this on, because it seems like John Franklin and I on Early Stoppage talk about this. Like, if it's not every week, it's every other week. Now, we don't believe the point, but I don't know what the solution is. I really don't. We've kind of tried every little bit. Project Spearhead. Do you have a fighters union? Is that the only way that you can do it? I mean, in boxing, it's not like boxers are totally unionized. They have the Ali Act, so they have that.
And no one
rest
makes
on.
any money but the top 1%.
There is that too, but with a lot of these MMA fighters, that's the thing. I mean, you see John Jones, and he holds out, he wants more money. Is he speaking for the group? At times, it seems like he has tried to, but it's almost like you need to have your upper tier athletes, your Kamaru Usmans, your Masvidals, your John Jones, and so on and so forth, to really lobby for the rest of the fighters for higher pay. A rising tide always lifts all boats, as they say, and in an instance like this, I think that's almost the case, but it's tricky when, again, Pena, all of his career as a pro, on the undercards, outside of the UFC, fighting with the lower leagues, he can make more money in a boxing fight that was probably on, you know, again, a Saturday afternoon card in Florida. Who knows?
That's what I mean. Like,
It's just a shame.
Grievous Vasquez, favorite of Matt and Craig, just to throw out a name, but like Grievous Vasquez came off the bench for the Raptors and made $9 million a year. You don't hear about Grievous Vasquez fighting Jake Paul after he retires, because Grievous Vasquez is just a killer in the playoffs and should be respected as such. It's something that you really only see in combat sports, and it is a shame. And you bring up some of the names like the Masvidals, the John Jones, even the McGregors of the world, but those are the people who are being able to take advantage of the whole system and really make more money because of it. So it is really hard to go to a guy like Jorge Masvidal and say, hey, I have this crazy idea. We're going to ask you to make less money so that a bunch of people you don't know are going to make more money. And I understand, to you, me, and everyone else, that makes a lot of sense because those people who aren't making any money, like, it really is a shame when you see people fighting on TV are only making like $10,000 to show up, and they'll make another $10,000 if they're lucky to win.
And then there's a percentage to your manager and a percentage to your gym and your coaches, and you got to pay to get people there and your nutrition and everything. As long as you don't live in Vegas, it's very difficult. And for me, it's the plight of, okay, let's pick a young Canadian fighter. Lupi Godinez that fought last week against Penne. Listen, Godinez won that fight, but we can go home till the cows come home. We can continue to talk about judging and decisions. But for Lupi, you come in on short notice. You're not making a lot of money. You had to travel to the States. You trained in Denver. Then you got to go back to Vancouver. You're going to be quarantined for a couple weeks. Then you get back to training. You got to pay everybody. It's just really, really difficult. So we'll move on from this one, Matt.
I don't know if you guys are flown in Canada. It's expensive.
That's true. Let's bring it on over to a bit more of a lighthearted topic, Matt. It seems as if your current UFC heavyweight champ, Francis Ngannou, is going to be cornering his pal, his new pal, in Kamaru Usman this weekend. And we had Usman in Ngannou's corner at the last fight. It worked out pretty good for Ngannou. Now you're going to have Ngannou in Usman's corner. And I would expect that having a guy like Francis Ngannou in and around the training camp of Usman that took place over with Elevation, but also he's been in Vegas for a little bit now. He's been in Extreme Couture, just getting the rounds in. And we've seen that with a lot of fighters. I remember talking about it, and this was a really weird one, but Max Grecian, before he fought Dustin Jacoby, he was at Extreme Couture. He wasn't at Akmat Fight Club. Yikes. So there have been a lot of fighters mixing it up, going to whatever gym they can for a few weeks to get acclimatized and ready. And you look at this one, Ngannou Usman. Does he help him any more than just emotional support, or are you going to get technical advice from Francis?
Well, that's the thing, right? Because Kamaru can teach Francis quite a few skills. That's the thing. When I ask myself, who's the more skilled out of the two? Well, of course it's Kamaru Usman. Like, yes, he has a lot of those physical attributes. He's a lot stronger than most other guys. He's got the cardio and whatnot. But just the X's and O's of the whole thing. Well, yeah, Kamaru Usman's way more technical than Francis, and Francis can get away with a lot of his, let's just say some of his amateurish techniques because he has that power X factor. So maybe it is just a confidence booster. Maybe it is like if Masvidal's having any success at all and Francis is just staring at him the whole time, like I'd probably want to hit a guy in the face less when his best friend's Francis Ngannou. But it is kind of weird. It kind of reminds me of when LeBron drafted Giannis first overall in the draft, and then he was like, maybe in free agency one day you'll remember about this. It just is kind of weird because I don't know what technical advice Francis can really give Kamaru Usman other than maybe they are just boys and it would be a confidence boost for Usman. It's a nice thing to see because when the best in the world are training with the best in the world and around each other, they're all going to help each other. Iron sharpens iron in that regard. So hopefully we do get the best version of this, and maybe Francis is some genius in the corner and we just don't know about it yet.
We'll see what happens, but I am looking forward to it. It'd be pretty cool to have the heavyweight champ in your corner. You've got the champion from Nigeria. You've got the champion from Cameroon. Awesome stuff to see, Matt. We'll move it on over to the heavyweights. And Matt, we've done Bellator interviews in the past. We get the emails. We go through them. So one of the weird things, and we talk a lot about Bellator, and a lot of people, when it was just UFC card after UFC card after UFC card, and Bellator popped back up, it's, guys, can you get back to the Bellator content? Or, guys, we didn't even know you did Bellator content. And to me, they put out these rankings, but if you go onto the Bellator website, it is so hard to find their rankings because, well, they don't really even show them. They send them out in emails, they make promotion out of it, but they don't even have them on their website. I love Bellator. I want them to do better. Bellator, do better with your rankings. But the purpose of the whole segment is, and you can see it up in front of you, Bellator now has their heavyweight rankings. And there was a name that crept up onto these rankings this week. He's 3-0. He hasn't fought since late last year where he beat a guy with a name like an old Southern gentleman, Brandon Carlton. It's not Carlton, it's Carlton. And he beat him by split decision in a fight that Carlton fans, whoever you are, thought that Brandon could have won. Jake Hager, a.k.a. Jack Swagger, ranked heavyweight with Bellator in a division that has enough talent. Not great talent, but enough talent. I was surprised by it. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the rankings, but also the addition of Jack Swagger, who doesn't even have a fight on the horizon.
Well, to start on the rankings, here's the thing. Most people are like, you guys cover Bellator. Most people right now are like, wait, they have rankings? Because that's the first problem. If you're going to have rankings, the rankings are just a really easy way so that someone who doesn't follow the sport all that closely still has a general idea as to where, who the good fighters are. And I understand there's a lot of fighters who aren't ranked who probably could be ranked. They just haven't had the opportunities yet. But that's what it is. It's just an easier way to follow the sport if you're not all that locked in. It's easy to be like, oh, this guy's ranked 7th. He's fighting a guy ranked 3rd. They must both be really, really good. But the fact that you can't find the rankings in the first place is a big issue. And the rankings, they only came into place when the UFC first did the Fox deal. And Fox wanted, and I know you don't like this term, but the casual audience member, something to make it easier for them to follow along with. So the UFC came up with their rankings. And yes, the rankings are flawed, but I do think that they get their job across. They are good for, hey, number 9's fighting number 2. If they beat number 2, then hey, they'll probably be in that top 3. Maybe they can get a title shot. So that's great. But the great thing about the UFC rankings is that on their website, they have a whole part that says rankings. All you do is click on that and it's right there. In Bellator, you hit fighters, you look through the fighters, and there is nothing that says rankings unless you are a member of their email list. So A, it's just really hard to find the rankings, and B, it's tough. If you are one of those people who are just a hardcore UFC fan, you don't watch a lot of Bellator, having Jake Hager in your rankings is kind of a reason why it is tough to respect some of Bellator's roster as much as you can for the UFC, because I feel like Bellator, for the last 4 or 5 years at least, their top 3 in about every division could hang with the top 3 in the UFC. And the top of the top, their champions, would give the champions of the UFC really hard fights. It's just after you do look at that top 5, top 6, maybe even top 9 or 10 in some divisions, that's when it does drop off. And like you said with heavyweight, it's not like heavyweight's one of those divisions in Bellator. They do have a few decent fighters there, so it's surprising that they do have to resort to adding Hager into their top 10.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I look at it. Hager, not ranked last week. He's now 10. Davion Franklin, while he's only 2-0, he wasn't ranked before.
Minikov's not there.
Davion Franklin is a super, super wrestler, and he's a really hot prospect. And he's one of those guys that, yeah, he might fight on a featured prelim or down on the prelims, but you have to watch him fight. But you're right. Ayala, Mitrione, Maori, Fortune, Vassell, Moldavsky, Congo, Johnson, Bader. Johnson's on a run right now. It might sound silly. And, I mean, Moldavsky looks like, is he future champ? Like, what's the scoop? But then I go down from there. Yeah, it is really weird. Fortune, Maori, they have pretty high ceilings, but it's just an odd spot for Bellator. I just wish they would do better. Come on, Bellator. Please, for us.
It'd be nice.
Maybe. It would be nice. Matt, I'm going to end the Twitter purge on this, and this was really interesting news. Now, you got the picture up. Nikki Holskin is going to be taking on John Wayne Parr. And if you're a kickboxing fan from 2005, this is going to get you up and excited. This is a good fight with one championship, and it is tonight as we film this. This show will come out on Thursday, and by then you'll know the result. And if you're in Singapore in the stadium a week ago, well, you probably already do know the result. But that's not the point. John Wayne Parr went out of his way on Instagram to talk about one championship's hydration testing, and this is something that we haven't really heard of elsewhere at all. Gary Tonan's talked about it a little bit in interviews where, yeah, they do it. Like, I asked him about it. It was like, Gary, what do they do? Well, they do it, and we have to, but that's it. John Wayne Parr actually delved into it, and you can find the post still up on his Instagram. Surprised nobody's asked him to take it down, a la Will Chope. But here, you look at it, well, my first hydration test was a complete disaster. Basically what happened, he wanted to find a loophole. He weighed in where he was supposed to be, but his hydration levels weren't good. Then he drank a bunch of water, tried it again, didn't work. And then by the end of it, for him to get all the water into his system and weigh back in, he missed weight by quite a bit. He was supposed to weigh in, 77 kilos, and he weighed in at 80 kilos and finally had all the water left in him. So, A, good. B, he couldn't run because he still has that hip issue.
That's okay. This is my first thing. This is my first red flag. Why is John Wayne Parr allowed to fight Nikki Holskin in 2021? He doesn't have his original hips, and Nikki Holskin is much younger and a very dangerous knockout artist. And I understand it's not like it's not 2016. Holskin's not in his prime anymore. We're not dealing with like champ Nikki Holskin. He's still a much better fighter than what John Wayne Parr is today. And that's the big issue. This is kind of one championship kickboxing's version of Tito versus Chuck Liddell 3. Tito might be old and past his prime, but he's a hell of a lot closer to it than Chuck Liddell is. And that's kind of the point with this fight. Nicky Holskin's past his prime, but just barely. Like, he can still have competitive fights with really good Muay Thai fighters. John Wayne Parr has barely been fighting, and he did retire after his hip surgery.
He's retired a lot.
Exactly. After his hip surgery, though, because he was worried about his mobility. So my first red flag about all this, not even the hydration test, is why would one championship give him this fight? We all know what's going to happen tonight. Or like you had said, if you were one of the select few in the arena last week, you already know the result. Just really weird, first of all. And secondly, that's the thing. You had mentioned it with Gary Tonin, how he's kind of mentioned the one hydration test restrictions and whatnot. No one really knows what they are 100%, and that's the problem. The fact that an extended Instagram post is the best information that we have on their practice regarding hydration tests just leaves a sour taste in my mouth, because that's as far as our knowledge goes right now. They don't allow media to observe their weigh-ins. That's what you would do if you're really sketchy and you don't have real weigh-ins. So for me, as someone who media or not, just as a fan of this sport, you have to look at this and say, okay, no one can observe the weigh-ins, but from what we do know, they don't have a practice that's like anything else in MMA. But they claim that they fixed weight cutting. And if they really are out there in the best interest of the athlete, and you claim that you fixed weight cutting, why would you not share that with other promotions? Why would you not go out there and say, hey, we figured out a way so that athletes don't have to borderline kill themselves the day before a fist fight?
So, hold on. Let's take John Wayne Parr's word as law, and let's say that they really do care about your hydration levels and your weight. It seems like a good system in this Instagram post as a thought, and from what old John Wayne Parr had to say before going to fight Nicky... Well, no, it'd be after he fought Nicky Holskin, because this is a week later. He just posted this 8 hours ago. But again, the tape delay is just silly, and the gambling lines come out the day of, and they go crazy. I mean, listen, we did see, and credit to Adam Martin out there, fellow Canadian, but look at the line for Lapicus and Alvarez right before they fought. It was super, super sketchy and went way up for Lapicus. And then, boom, you had that weird ending.
I'm not saying Chatry lives in a Black Mirror episode, but it's starting to look that way.
So either way, I mean, it's a good idea in theory. It seems like it's a good idea. And if that's the way that it works for the rest of the fighters, I like it as an idea. It's just we need to know more about this than a kickboxer that's retired 1, 2, 3, 4, however many times, is coming out of retirement to fight a fellow older kickboxer, and this is the way that we get our information. This isn't the right way.
If you get your information from someone who's middle-aged off of social media, then you're doing something wrong, because the majority of it's just conspiracy theories. And again, the other half of John Wayne Parr's theory is, this is my issue. He's a 40-something-year-old kickboxer, and he has the best information available on their weight-cutting practices. It would be really nice if one championship could come out and have this big press release saying, here, we'll detail everything that involves their hydration test. That would be really nice, and it would reassure even just the casual audience that, okay, what they're doing is in the athlete's best interest. But then, even just the eye test, and I understand you can't take the eye test, but when you watch some one championship fights, and some people are obviously far bigger than their opponents, and you have to wonder to yourself, well, okay, if everyone made their hydration test, then how do some people get away with cutting what would seem like extreme amounts of weight and then they still be able to put it back on? It's just, there's a lot of oh by the ways with one championship that it's not always nice as an audience member.
Have to see what happens with one championship. When this episode comes out, you'll have the answer. I mean, did John Lineker beat Troy Lamson? I don't know, but we'll find out. Ultimately, really love the Twitter Purge. All sorts of great stuff there. Let's flip it on over for a second. And as always with Fight Night Picks, and I say as always, it's been like 3 weeks, we have some really good interviews on the channel from our own JHK MMA, who's used to be a friend of the show, now a member of the show. And he's interviewed a lot of great guests. And I have quite a few interviews just booked off. They're kind of saved away, squirreled away. And I can release them as needed. I mean, we had a great one come out with Kai Kamaka III here recently. He's got a big fight coming up. Rude Boy Randy Brown, there's an interview with him. He's got a big fight this weekend against Alex Cowboy Oliveira. But Matt, one of my favorite interviews that we've gotten recently, Patricio Pipple, that's a pretty good one too.
Very good one.
Is actually from Brett Johns, who has a really big fight coming up with Bellator in the near future. And for Brett Johns, he seemed like a really good prospect with the UFC. He was going out there and beating Tony Gravely, who had a really big win last week. Like, the sky was kind of the limit for Brett Johns until he faced, you know, the Aljamain Sterlings of the world and so on and so forth. But Brett had a really good run. And then all of a sudden he was with Bellator, and it was just odd to the MMA fan. You might not have heard what had happened. Brett kind of touched on it a little bit in the interview with JHK. That one's going to come out in the next couple of days, but we'll toss out the exclusive drop, and Brett kind of touches on, the exit from the UFC now over with Bellator.
But obviously, super happy with getting the win there. That was number one. And then obviously leading up to the next fight, we had an offer from the UFC, and that was the end of my contract, and I just wanted to kind of get paid the same as what I felt like other fighters were on. So, for example, like Merab Dashvili, I won't talk about figures, but I'll just say that I wanted the same amount as him. And because he was 5-2 with the promotion, I was 5-2 with the promotion. And I just felt like at the time, it felt like it was a fair. I wasn't asking for more. I was just asking for the same. And the UFC just didn't budge really, So obviously I have a great management team with Sucker Punch, with Brian Butler and that. So I messaged Brian and said, look, Brian, what can we do? And all fairness to me, Brian turned around to me and went, Bellator, look, just contact Bellator and we'll see what they will do. And the conversation, I didn't rush into it, but the conversation lasted about half an hour. It was that quick, really, before the decision was made. People will say, oh, look, you rushed into it. But this is what I'm trying to explain to people who don't fight. This is a very difficult, job to be in. Super difficult. And I feel like we're not like normal human beings. We get beaten up day in, day out. And I feel like people, not just me, I'm just talking about fighters in general, should be paid, the right fee, really, And I did feel like I was getting a bit underpaid by the UFC. I did, but that's nothing personal towards UFC. I understand they're a business and I understand they've got things going. And when it comes to the promotion, absolutely fantastic promotion. It was great to work with them, and they have put me on that pedestal now where I am considered a top contender in the Bellator division because of my resume I had in the UFC. So I understand that. But I did feel like I wasn't getting paid what I was worth, and I wasn't asking for over the odds. I was asking for the same. So when I spoke to Bellator come back with the offer. They basically matched the offer that I wanted, and that was that, really. We were looking to fight in November, but obviously with the whole visa situation and going to the US Embassy in London, that was not available because of the whole lockdown scenario. So obviously, we did actually accept the fight in November, but it did kind of turn out to be like, oh, look, sorry, you haven't got a visa, it won't be able to work, but we look to get you matched for March. So then obviously the start of this year, I started training the first week of January, ready for March, and then turns around, they're going, right, we haven't got a show until April. So I'm like, well, okay, I'll get ready for April. And then they've turned around and said, look, it's not April. I think it was beginning of April. I said, beginning of April. And it was like, no, it's mid-April. And then I was like, right, okay. And then it turns out then that once I had the contract through, it was the 21st of May. So, it's been a 14-week camp to this point. I've still got another 4 weeks to go. So it's been a long camp. But then again, in the same breath, me and my team don't actually do camps. I think camps is an old terminology thing. Camps, we're always training. We might take a week off and enjoy with our friends, but the camp thing, I've never actually done a camp. It's just been one long straight through road. Yeah, okay. I've taken more than a week off here and there just because of injuries and stuff. But like I said, I've taken 2 weeks off, and I can't actually remember taking more than 2 weeks off since April 2016, and that was because of shoulder surgery. So, it has been a long camp, but in the same breath, I feel like I'm ready. My weight's down. But mentally, I feel brilliant. I feel so happy right now. Obviously, Mateus Matos is a tough fight. But like I said, if I go in there happy and my skills on point, I feel like we're going to do the job.
And a really great interview from Brett Johns. When that one drops, make sure you check it out here on the channel. Matt, this wouldn't be This Week in MMA without actually talking about the fights that we have coming out.
Oh, yeah.
There's PFL coming out on Friday. KSW's on the weekend. UFC 261. And while we already gave our official previews and predictions for the entire UFC card, We have some really interesting PFL and KSW coming up. And Matt, I can't wait to talk about our main event from each of those two cards. I mean, you got Clay Collard, the boxing champion, the people's champion, who had a really good run between 2019 2020. Now kind of going back at MMA after about 2 years away. And with KSW, a rematch for the heavyweight title, we have Phil DeFries taking on Tomasz Narkun. I can't wait to talk about them, and I can't wait to get into the previews and predictions.
Let's get into it.
Big time card coming up this Friday. It's the return of the PFL, and it's a really interesting organization that Matt's had some thoughts about in the past. But we have a Striker's Paradise in our main event, so you can get up for this one. It's Anthony Showtime Pettis, the former UFC champ, the last man to win a fight with WEC, and he's taking on Cassius Clay Collard. And for Collard, it's really been the headlines that have been grabbed outside of the cage and in the boxing ring. He's had a very, very decent run, I guess I would say, with boxing. 9-4-3. Maybe not the greatest record, but he was on a little bit of a run between 2019 and 2020. At the end of the last year, you know, in December and in February this year, a couple of losses by decision. So it kind of derailed the boxing for a little bit, but he's entering the cage for the first time in about 2 years, and you look at the 5-on-in for Collard, it is good. I mean, 4-1. It's better than 3-2 for Anthony Pettis. You look at the level of competition on the regional scene. He knocked out Troy Dennison about 3 years and 3 months ago. He beat Carson Hardman. That's a good name. Submitted him. Lost to Derek Minner by submission. That's going to happen.
If you're going to lose to Derek Minner, that's normally how.
Beat Lucas Montoya, and then he beat Randall Wallace. And listen, for Clay Collard, you know what you're going to get. But again, he's been away for 2 years, boxing exclusively. The last time he boxed was in February, and we knew Clay Collard was going to be included into the PFL's lightweight season, so it's not much of a surprise. It is a bit of a surprise to me that they gave him Anthony Pettis, and I threw down the last weigh-in. I mean, 154.6 you'll see on certain sites, 167 whether it's boxing or MMA. For Pettis' last fight, he weighed in at 170 on the nose, and he picked up a huge win over Alex Morono not that long ago, about 4 months ago. Before that, he beat Donald Cerrone. Wasn't the most exciting fight. Wasn't the fight that we expected. I'm just kidding. Pettis looked pretty good. He lost to CDF. He lost to Nate Diaz. He beat Wonder Boy. That was his fifth to last fight about 2 years ago. So that's a 5-on-in for Pettis. You know what you're going to get out of Collard. But the weird thing is, you look at the level of competition for Pettis, and for Collard, yeah, he had that one fight against Derek Minner, but the last high-level guys that he fought, like big names, was when he was in the UFC, 2014, 2015, lose to Max Holloway by finish in his UFC debut. He was really young, though. I mean, again, 2014, and he's 28 now. He ended up beating a name that you recognize in Alex White. He lost to Gabriel Benitez, and he lost to Thiago Traitor. It's weird. It's weird.
Thank you for Clay Collard's life story. Now, here's the thing. This is a terrible fight for Clay Collard. It really is. And just go back to when Conor McGregor fought Dustin Poirier. People were like, oh, Conor McGregor, he spent 6 months boxing. Now all he does is box in the cage. And everyone was like, oh, he's just a boxer now. Look at his stance. He fought a guy who mainly only boxes in MMA, but throws a few kicks. And those kicks gave him a lot of trouble. So we're dealing with a guy who was a good boxer, a great MMA fighter, and then he made his boxing style a little bit more into his MMA style. All Anthony Pettis does is kick, and Clay Collard hasn't seen a kick in about 2 years. This just stylistically is a very tough matchup for Clay Collard. And for Collard, this is the issue. You're not even asking him to fight a fighter who has a style similar to what he's been seeing in the boxing ring. If you asked him to fight just even... not in the same weight class, but just use a name, Calvin Kattar, or even a Josh Emmett, guys who really are boxing primary MMA fighters who are going to go in there and mainly use their hands to set up all their offense, I'd say, hey, Clay Collard has a chance. He's fighting a guy who has good boxing, great power, really good speed, and more kicks than most MMA fighters know. And the fact that Anthony Pettis does everything with his kicks. He's not a fighter who he'll throw a combination to end it with a kick. His kicks are actively involved in his combination. So for Clay Collard, I understand he is not just a boxer, and that's just the profession he's been doing for the last couple of years. But even if you've been boxing, those are the looks that you're used to. You're used to boxers. You're used to big gloves that you can cover up a lot with and that are really hard to get clean shots off when using them defensively. Anthony Pettis is really, really good at MMA boxing. So for Clay Collard, I just don't know if he's going to incorporate the takedown, if somehow he can hold Anthony Pettis down and wear him out to the point where Pettis won't have that pop on his shots. But I see Pettis being the much faster out of these two, and I think he's the much harder hitter out of the two as well.
Anthony Pettis is a big favorite in this fight, and for me, again, Pettis moving down to 55, maybe Collard, maybe he's got a little bit of an advantage that way, but that's the only thing I can think of. Big difference in age. Collard just turned 28. For Anthony Pettis, he just turned 34, and that's still young, but he's not young in fight years. I mean, he's had absolute war since the WEC days. You got to focus on this, though. Again, you talk about Anthony Pettis setting everything up with the kicks, and we talk about which martial art is the best for MMA. Is it boxing? No. It's good to have a boxing, at least some boxing acumen, I should say. Who's the best boxer you can think of at MMA? Holly Holm, maybe? Really? Like, best pure boxer
Max
in MMA?
Holloway.
Izu Agono, maybe? Max Holloway? All right. But we continue on. There are good boxers in MMA.
Hollow.
But you have to be well-rounded. Wrestling, right up there. You've got, Sonda. You've got Sambo, Jiu-Jitsu. For Anthony Pettis, he has that Taekwondo background, and you never hear of anybody in MMA being good at Taekwondo. Valerie Lareda? I mean, there's not a whole lot of fighters that can incorporate Taekwondo well enough in an MMA fight. Anthony Pettis does it to perfection. If I think that TJ Dillashaw, at one point, I still think it in the back of my mind, is the best MMA wrestler, and you can argue me till the cows come home, but I still think he is. But Anthony Pettis, the best at Taekwondo and MMA at the highest level. So we'll see how Pettis makes out against Collard, but if you did go back, and we certainly did, to watch the Morono fight, Pettis, kick heavy, kick heavy, kick heavy. And that was a statement performance knowing he was probably going to leave the UFC anyway. But if you can do that against a primary boxer in Alex Morono, who, yeah, he's a good grappler, he has decent wrestling, but Morono sets things up with the hands. If you want a fun fight of his, go watch his fight against Max Griffin. Exactly how he did it. But Pettis, to me, should run over poor Clay Collard.
It's the speed for Anthony Pettis. That's the thing. You normally see power can somewhat diminish as you get older. Speed's normally the first thing that goes, though. But for Pettis, even as he gets close to 235, he's still the fastest guy in the cage when he's in there. Like, even when he did fight Cowboy, even when he fought Poirier and Ferguson, all those killers on his crazy run in the UFC, Pettis was still normally the faster guy in there. And now you're asking... Pettis has tools in his arms and his feet. You're basically asking a guy who has half the tools to now fight a guy who's much faster than him. This is a very hard fight for Clay Collard. That's it, plain and simple.
Yeah, it is a really tricky one. And if we have a look at the odds, Matt, Anthony Pettis, a big favorite, open to minus 360. Wish I got him there. He's a minus 614 right now. For Clay Collard, open to plus 260. He's a plus 416. And if we have a look at the Tapology votes, and again, it's a surprise to us as it's a surprise to you.
Is it a surprise?
521 of them because everybody's watching the PFL. 95% Pettis, 43% by decision, 17% by submission, 36% by knockout. For the 5% that have Collard, 50% by knockout. Matt, that's a very slim percentage of people in general. I like Pettis in this fight.
Yeah, by quite a bit. Probably by finish, too.
Matt, both of us going with Anthony Pettis to get the win in his PFL debut. It sounds as strange to me coming out of my mouth as hopefully it does to you at home listening, or if you're in the car or on the boat, on the lake, wherever you might be. Enjoy the fights. We got a big PFL card coming up this weekend. We're going to talk about it in depth as the show goes on. So hopefully you can stick around for that. Matt, keep locked in with Fight Night Picks as we always say. Let's get into it. UFC 261 coming up this Saturday. We have a rematch between Jorge Masvidal and Kamaru Usman. And with KSW 60, we have the rematch that you didn't know you needed. We have Phil DeFries defending his heavyweight belt against the man himself, the light heavyweight champ, Tomasz Narkun. And Matt, in their first fight, it wasn't overly close, so I'm kind of surprised that we're getting this fight. In the second round, I mean, Phil DeFries had to do the Coppertone girl type thing with the dog biting at her swim trunks because, yeah, Narkun went to grab for something. He got full extension ass cheek, and we continued on. But really, for me, it was how good Phil DeFries' striking looked early on. Like, he had Narkun dropped in the first round, rocked him in the second round. Like, his grappling was overwhelming. And that's the thing that we've seen from Phil DeFries. If you're just a casual observer of the career of Sunderland's own, and listen, I've got a Crystal Palace jersey on today, so we won't talk too much about Sunderland, but when I look at Phil DeFries from his early days in the UFC, and we even learned a little bit from when we had him on the show years ago, it was the fact that he really had to overcome, the mental demons to get into the cage. He had bad anxiety. He had a hard time making it. The Miocic fight is a staple for him in a bad way. And since he left the UFC, pretty tidy little run that he's been on. He hasn't lost since 2017. And if you look at that fight, he lost to the Ural Hulk, Ivan Shkrikov. The guy that the UFC wouldn't take because he was taking too much juice. So
I think the needle melted when they tried to test him.
You're going to lose a fight like that, but he is on a tidy little win streak. I'll talk about the opponents later on, but it is an interesting fight because, again, if you barely watch KSW, these guys are must-see TV for KSW fans.
Phil DeFries is basically the Stipe Miocic of KSW at this point. Like, if you look at the run that he's been able to go on, especially as of late and after he's in the UFC, he's just so much more technical than most of the guys he's in the cage with. And the great thing about DeFries is that, his wrestling and his cardio were always great. Those are two things you could never really question. But the fact that his striking really has come to fruition and really improved to the point where he isn't just known as that wrestler, grappler kind. He can go out there and get it done with his hands too. And that's really the neat thing about DeFries and his evolution. We see a lot of guys who, they have their career and then they go into the UFC after they hit it big. Well, with Phil DeFries, he kind of needed to have his career in the opposite way. He needed to get the UFC almost out of the way for him to really become the MMA fighter he is today. And I'm not going to sit here and say Phil DeFries could beat Francis Ngannou or he could beat Jairzinho Rozenstruik and Cyril Gane, but that's not the case. He's gone over and just dominated KSW, and the fact that he has consistently gotten better fight in and fight out, which is something we rarely do see from champions. Normally it's you get to become the champ and then you fight in somewhat more of a safe manner. Well, with Phil DeFries, he's finishing more fights now that he is the champ. And with Tomasz Narkun, this will be an interesting fight, but I do agree with you. Their first fight was so one-sided that I am kind of surprised that they are putting it back together, because we did see the improvements from Phil DeFries, not only his striking, but just his speed on the feet in total. He looked to be the much faster guy, which you would not really suspect the heavyweight in there with the light heavyweight moving up. And for Narkun, it is kind of weird because speed is something he struggles with. Even go back to the Mamed Khalidov fight. I went back and rewatched his first and second fight with him. He gets dropped by Khalidov in both those fights, mainly because Khalidov is so much faster than Narkun. And where Narkun gets his bread buttered, he is so good on the ground in his top position. He's got great submissions. But the problem when you're fighting a guy like Phil DeFries, who physically can just match you, he is the bigger guy, but he's also the faster and I'd argue more technical guy. It is going to be hard to find an area of this fight where Tomasz Narkun can have a lot of success.
I mean, Narkun, you talk about it, the guy's 18-3 in his relatively young career. I mean, the guy's 31. You look at the wins, the last two, Ivan Erslan, he beat him at KSW 56 back in November. Before that, Przemysław Misiala, a guy that was over on, what was he, Ultimate Fighter, like a very, very long time ago, a name that I had to memorize before I was talking about, well, really any of Narkun's fight. And then the DeFries fight. Before that, the two fights against Khalidov, Marcin Wojcik, and then, Sokaju back in 2016. Narkun hasn't been the most active guy, like 2018, 2019, 2020, yes, but before that, not as much. You look at some of the losses, Vyacheslav Vasilevsky, stuff like that's going to happen. Goran Recic, that was back KSW 29, 2014. So the only loss, again, decision to DeFries, decision before that, and he did, get finished back, 10 years ago now? So it has been a while, and that was a young Narkun. You look at the overall body of work, 14 of his wins by submission. For Phil DeFries, same thing, submission artist. Out of all of his wins, 12 of 19 by submission. He's on a 7-fight win streak since 2017. And the thing that I like about it, maybe some of the names aren't the best. Like Anton Vyazegin, that's a good win. That was a guy that I thought would become like that next coming out of M1. Go and watch him fight Sergey Haratonov in a fight that he lost. But Vyazegin seemed to be one of those guys. And then he beats Colossus with Bellator. Listen, you're beating James Thompson in 2017. It doesn't mean a lot. Androzek was a really big win in 2018, coming into KSW and beating a KSW guy. Finishing Karel Baydorf. You got to realize, Karel Baydorf at one point was at like the height of his powers. This was the guy, and he submitted him. That's great. Beats Narkun. Beats Luis Enrique, the guy that was in the UFC, by split. He was on the wrong end of a split decision, last weekend, Enrique, in the lower levels. And then he beat Michael Kita in a fight that probably shouldn't have happened because Kita was 40 years old.
Yeah, it was.
And that wasn't that long ago. That was back in December, but not a lot of miles on the clock for DeFries in that one. So we have this fight where both guys, I wouldn't say similar styles, but the thing that I like, they both come from really good gyms. For Narkun, it's BT Gym or Berserker's team. I looked up some of the names. Materla is one of the guys. Baydorf has trained there in the past. They have a huge team of big guys that he trains with in Poland. For Phil DeFries, He trains out of a few different gyms, and I mentioned the Sunderland connection before. I mean, Team Fish Tank, they have it on Tapology. I've seen it on other sites too. But then you dig into it. So that's TFT MMA. Lukasz Porobiec, who also has trained before at Berserker Team, has trained with Phil DeFries. I find that kind of weird. But another guy that I've seen him train with at Team Cowbon, Tom Aspinall, and that was even in the last couple of weeks. And he's gone to Liverpool and he's trained with the guys at Team Cowbon. So whether that's Aspinall, his dad, the jiu-jitsu coach, whether that's Darren Till, whether that's, well, little Mike Grundy wouldn't. He just wouldn't. But
Probably
overall, Phil DeFries putting in the work to advance his overall body of work, I absolutely love that.
No, I couldn't agree more, and that's why I do favor him so heavily over Narkun in this rematch, because you look at how good he looked in the first fight, and I do believe DeFries has gotten better since that first fight, whereas Narkun, I do think he has improved somewhat, but the thing he's going to have to improve in is the wrestling, and I don't see many situations where Narkun's the one taking Phil DeFries down, whereas DeFries, if he wants to beat him up on the feet, I think he's more than technical enough to do that. I think he's the faster of the two, and he's a much better wrestler to top it all off, so I do like Phil DeFries in this rematch.
Phil DeFries, there's only two sites that have the odds on it. Open to minus 133, he's a minus 168 right now. For Narkun, he opened up a minus 105, he's a plus 133. And over on Tapology, 248 total votes. There's not a lot, but they will get there before Saturday. 82% DeFries, 68% by decision. For the 18% that have Narkun, 75% by knockout. Yeah, I like Phil DeFries. I know he's the older fighter, but the thing is, he's well conditioned for the division. The other thing that I didn't like out of Narkun, and maybe it was because he got rocked, but in the second round of their last fight, he kind of looked labored. He had his hands down, like he was breathing out of his mouth. It didn't look all that good. This is a guy that, even at 205, you look at it and you read through the comments, he's not the biggest light heavyweight either. That's a weird thing.
It really is.
And he's tall, but he's not the biggest guy.
So we both have Phil DeFries.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. We both have Phil DeFries. That's it.
I couldn't agree more.
That's the pick, Matt. Really looking forward to KSW 60 coming up this weekend. There's a lot of great fights on that card. I mean, your co-main event, holy smokes, you got Zielkowski taking on Kazeshko. It's a difficult one. You also have Izu Ugono, main training partner of Jan Blachowicz, the former boxer, on this main card.
Got a lot of shine on the Countdown show, oddly enough, and in all the embeddeds.
He really did, but it is a great card. I can't wait for it. Saturday, it starts at 11 a.m. Eastern. I'm going to be tuning into it. We love the international MMA. Big KSW guys. And listen, in the absence of Bellator this week, Matt, you've got PFL starting back up, KSW 60, and UFC 261. So join in with the Fight Companion question mark kicks on Saturday. Keep it locked in with Fight Nate Picks, and as we always say, let's get into it. In the revamp this week in MMA, we brought out what's called MMA Landscaping. We're talking about the overall landscape of MMA, and normally, you know, it's some of the other promotions that are out there. There's an ACA card this weekend, some big fights over there. There are some other cards. I mean, one championship's going on as we're filming. But the two big cards, PFL, the start of the 2021 season, that's on Friday, and on Saturday morning, KSW 60. Now, you got the full preview and prediction for Pettis and Collard. You also got DeFries and the man himself, Tomasz Narkun. But overall, this card that we have coming up to start off the PFL, 10 fights, and some pretty big names and guys that you would recognize. So, Matt, if we go through this one a little bit, and we will, I mean, first fight, Loic Radzhabov taking on Alex Martinez, the Canadian fighter that's also representing another country as well, kind of all over the map. I know they have the flag behind him that's not from Canada, but if you do look it up, he's from Paraguay. You look up some of the fights with Brave, XFFC, Hard Knocks, plenty of finishes on his record. Loic Radzhabov, dynamite in his hands. I really like that fight. And if we move up through it, I mean, people might recognize Sung Bin Jo had that one fight against, watch out for your underwears in the UFC. His brother didn't work out all that well, and then the UFC cut him, taking on Tyler Diamond that people are familiar with. Chris Wade, another guy that's been around with World Series, but also PFL and the UFC. Jolinton Luderbach is a guy that I'm really looking forward to, so I'll flip through this card on the MMA Landscaping screen. But Matt, what are some of the fights that you're really looking forward to?
I'm really excited for Brendan Loughnane and Shimon Moraes. It's not often that I get mad that Dana White doesn't sign somebody from Tuesday Night Contender Series, but Brendan Loughnane was just terrible that they didn't sign him, and especially after his quote after the fight was, "I pissed blood, man. That's really screwed up." So for Loughnane, just an all-action kind of a fighter. For Shaman, he was really good with the PFL, or not the PFL, with WSOF back in the PFL's, I guess, first edition. And then you know what you're going to get from him, too. It's just an all-action kind of fighter. We know that from his time in the UFC as well. This PFL card really is one of those sneaky stat cards.
Sneaky card. After the Loughnane fight, you have your champ, Lance Palmer, kicking off the main card, taking on Bubba Jenkins. And listen, you might look at it and go, well, geez, those aren't the most exciting fighters I've ever seen. Very high-level wrestlers, so you know exactly what you're going to get there. I was surprised, though, because above that, you have Mavlid Haibulev taking on Lazar Stojadinovic. And listen, what I do know is that Mavlid Haibulev is one of the most explosive strikers that you're going to find out there. And if you want a disgusting knockout, Haibulev, when he took on Damon Jackson and absolutely crunched him in 10 seconds with a flying knee, that was amazing. On top of that, you have your former champion. And that's the weird thing. I say former, you're two-time champions fighting in the co-main event in Natan Schultz, a guy who we had in the UFC. But again, he's won $2 million from the PFL. He's in the co-main event. Pettis collared in the main event. But you have Schultz taking on Marcin Held. Technically, that's a very good fight.
It should be a really fun fight. For Marcin Held, does he go for too many leg locks in MMA? Possibly. But just one of those fighters has been there and done that. And I know that sounds like I'm trying to be disrespectful, but I'm not. Like, Marcin Held, he's not the underground king like Eddie Alvarez, but he's been underground. And he's definitely hung out there. He's not royalty of it just yet.
He beat the Ryan Sanders at Bellator 93 at the arena that's in Lewiston, Maine. Like, that's where Marcin Held's been.
Exactly. He beat Nasrat Hakparas in a really weird fight that one time. So that's also a really fun fight in the co-main event. Then, of course, in the main event, we already broke it down. Anthony Pettis making his PFL showcase fight, perhaps, debut against Clay Collard. One of the big additions the PFL has had. There has been the Rory McDonald's of the world, Anthony Pettis, of course. And it does feel like Pettis has been the fighter that they've marketed the most, I would say, who has made the transition over for the UFC. So if Pettis is able to get the win over Clay Collard, expect them to really market him heavily during this event.
Love the card. Let's flip it on over to KSW 60. That one's on Saturday morning. Big time KSW card coming up on Saturday, and there are a lot of fights to look forward to. Overall, I mean, the main event, the rematch for the heavyweight title, your heavyweight champ, your light heavyweight champ. But going up and down this card, interesting. One of the names that jumped off the page to me is our boy Jakub, that's fighting to kick off the card. He got absolutely destroyed by Sebastian Prizovic in his last fight. It was an interesting fight. He got beat quite soundly. But I look up and down this card, Matt. There's a lot of recognizable names if you're a KSW fan. A lot of people that you've seen before. Alexander Illich is on this card. You also have Izu Ugono as well. Somebody that, as you mentioned in the breakdown for the main event, the UFC was absolutely fine talking about Izu Ugono. Like, big time in the camp of Jan Blachowicz to pump that fight. But I love the co-main and the main. I mean, Zielkowski, we talked about him training with some really high-level athletes. Like, when we do our UFC breakdowns, we start talking about KSW fighters. Hopefully it kind of resonates a little bit. But Zielkowski's one of those guys. He's got a big test in front of him. Ultimately, I expect he wins the fight. But overall, a good card. And one that I feel is definitely worth your time if you got something, you know, maybe you got something Saturday afternoon, but you got a little bit of time in the morning. This is something you should check out.
KSW, okay, so with Paul Asker, people were like, oh, production value, it was weird. With KSW, it's kind of weird, but I don't mean that in a bad way of like, they're going to be doing crazy stuff on air. Like, KSW is just a great product. Like, everything they do really is great. It's kind of like if Pride stationed themselves in Poland and Europe instead, and just kind of set up shop there, because it really is a unique product, but the MMA is so high level, and they really do have such a respect and appreciation for the sport that KSW really is just such a great thing that you really should get behind.
Yeah, and I mean, they don't have a weird rule set. So
no, they don't. It's easy to follow.
They get it. So I'm really looking forward to it. A great card. I can't wait for it. KSW 60. One of those things, I mean, we love to tune into the KSWs, but also you get the PFL this week. I'm really looking forward to this week in MMA, man.
Yeah. Not only this week in MMA, we've also got 2 new shows coming out. Well, not 2 new shows. 2 shows on Saturday. We've got, of course, Question Mark Kicks. That'll be 2 hours before the prelims, so make sure you tune in for that. And then, of course, since it is the pay-per-view, UFC 261. We have the rematch, Kamaru Usman, Jorge Masvidal. But more importantly, Craig, what are we going to be doing? A fight companion.
Yeah. No, it should be great. And we have some really good interviews. Like I said, Brett Johns at the start of the show. Really interesting to hear, kind of his departure from the UFC going over to Bellator. But a lot of great interviews already stacked from our own JHK MMA. So make sure you go out there. You check out some of the content with Fight Night Picks. And the best thing you can do for the boys, toss us a like, toss us a sub, and throw down a comment. Are you going to tune into KSW or PFL? We actually want to know that stuff. Let us know, because if so, we'll continue on with the content and we'll try and give you what you're looking for in your MMA, I guess, I don't know, your viewing activity. We're going to try and give you the best that we can. So ultimately, really looking forward to the weekend of MMA. Make sure you check out that UFC 261 content. Matt, as we always say with Fight Night Picks,
Let's get into it.